I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker of the day, Libby Peake, Head of Resource Policy at Green Alliance. Green Alliance is an independent charity and think tank focused on achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. And Libby will be helping us set the scene today by looking at lessons we can learn from other EPR schemes. Libby.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that introduction. And I am delighted to be here today to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is circular fashion. And if you'll indulge me a bit, I promise it is relevant. I thought we'd start with a little bit of audience interaction and a bit of a competition to see if anyone wants to guess. I'm going to step out from behind the podium so you can see how much this Vivienne Westwood dress that I'm wearing cost me at a charity shop in Tooting. Come on, someone. £15. You're too high, actually. It was 10. It's £10 for the Vivienne Westwood dress, and I'm wearing a helmet-laying jacket, which cost me £7.50 from a charity shop in Wandsworth, and both of them felt like robbery. And I know that as more and more people get interested in second-hand fashion, and businesses get interested in second-hand fashion, that might change, and it might be harder and harder to come by designer pieces at such bargains. So on a personal level, I am slightly sad about that, but at a professional level, I do think that that's the right thing. And if we're going to start having more circular fashion, it does have to be a business matter. So I'm really delighted that people are talking about it more and trying to figure out how to make it a reality. So Green Alliance does work a lot with businesses. We work with academics and charities as well. I lead our work on resources, and a lot of that is doing work through our Circular Economy Task Force, which is a business-led coalition that we've been convening for 12 years now. And those are some of the members. If anyone's interested to find out more, do please come and speak to me during the break. For the Circular Economy Task Force, we did actually do some recent research on textiles and fashion, which I'm here to talk about today. But first of all, just to sort of set the political scene, obviously businesses have been thinking a lot about this in the absence of government momentum on resources and waste policy, but the new government was elected on a one-word manifesto, which was change. The manifesto was 27,000 words long, but I only wanted to see 2 words in the entire manifesto, which were circular economy, and those were in the manifesto in the end. It was the first time that Labour had promised to bring about a circular economy, although I think actually all of the other all the other political parties had promised previously to bring about a circular economy and haven't managed to do so. But I think the initial signs from this government are that they are really mission-driven. They've hit the ground running, certainly when it comes to things like clean energy, renewable energy, and their missions around that. But they've also launched, they're also in the process of launching their own circular economy task force, which is going to be advised by a group of industry and civil society and academic experts. And it's going to produce a new circular economy strategy for England, which is going to be underpinned by roadmaps for particular sectors. And it's hard to imagine that textiles and fashion won't be one of those sectors that's looked at quite carefully, not least as Mary Cray, who's the minister responsible for circular economy, did a lot of work on the topic when she was the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, really highlighting the vast impact that the sector has. And I should say we're only slightly put out that the government took the name from our circular economy strategy for its ambitions, because it's great that they are doing something on this. So here's my old friend Vivienne Westwood. I think she got it towards the end, and she was really quite strong on the need to not just to change fashion, but sort of not just to tack recycling on the end, not just to think a bit about reuse, do a little bit of reuse, but to fundamentally rethink how much fashion people are buying. And so she said simply, buy less, choose well, make it last, quality, not quantity. Everybody's buying far too many clothes. And I think that the data does really bear that out, and I'm just going to flash up a few bits of the data, which I think really talk to the fashion industry's really high environmental price tag, and I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with some of these figures. But globally, the fashion industry is responsible for between 5 and 10% of emissions, and we did dig into those numbers to find out which one it was, because that's quite a big variety, but we couldn't figure it out. It's somewhere between 5 and 10. It's a lot. It's a lot more than people expect, I think. It's also responsible for 20% of industrial water pollution, which is a fair whack. And a lot of this does end up as waste. Some of it ends up as waste currently without ever being worn. And I do think that that's a scandal that people are becoming much more aware of. And I suppose there is increased interest in reuse, which I mentioned at the start, and which is absolutely a good thing. But part of the trouble is that this still isn't translating into a reduction in material use, so that although you see lots more platforms to buy used clothes, lots of companies are getting into reuse, some companies are getting into things like leasing. Globally, the rise of fashion, of textile purchases is still increasing, and it's outstripping GDP. It had a slight dip in COVID, but it's gone right back to shooting up beyond anything that could be considered sustainable now. These are the global figures. We have actually seen figures for the UK, and they're pretty similar. And we do have a particular problem, I think, in the UK. So for part of our project, we did initially calculate, we wanted to calculate not how far you could push recycling, and you could push recycling a lot more, but how far you could push a material reduction through various measures, including recycling. So we had a business as usual scenario where we considered that you could keep reuse at quite a high level in the UK. Reuse is quite popular in the UK. It's about 25% at the moment. So we kept it at about 25%. We increased recycling, I think, quite generously, from 1% fibre to fibre to 16% fibre to fibre in the business as usual scenario, and we had a displacement rate of 54%, which I think again is quite generous. I think the key is that you want people to buy used clothing, but then you don't want them to buy more and more and more clothing, which does seem to be sometimes what's happening today. And again, there's quite poor data, so I'm really excited that you've been taking it on yourself to get better data, because I think that really will help. But in the moderate scenario, we increased reuse to 40%, displacement to 60%, and recycling to 26%. And then we also calculated a technical maximum where we increased reuse to 60%. Obviously, you're not going to ever reuse all clothing. We increased displacement to 65%, so most of those purchases were offsetting new purchases. And we increased recycling to 53%, which we understand is the maximum technical potential. But if you do that, you can actually reduce material use in the fashion industry by 63%, which was a lot more than we were expecting when we were setting out to calculate these figures. So the potential to improve things is vast, especially if we're not just focusing on end of life, but really thinking about reduction as the goal. So we found out that was technically possible, and then we also did quite a bit of public polling to find out what the public wants and what they're most interested in seeing. And one of the interesting findings was that overwhelmingly they hold the industry itself responsible for improving things. 58% of people say that the producers are responsible for it, and the next most responsible, they said, was government. Oh no, actually no, the next most was the purchasers at 14%, and only 12% thought the government and political leaders were responsible. I don't agree with those figures. I think that government and political leaders could be doing a lot more along with industry, but it's interesting that the public really has an appetite to see the industry take charge and do things. They were very, very keen on things like banning the destruction of unsold or returned goods, and improving production processes. And I think these are things that should be relatively easy to implement. We also did some work along with our business partners at PwC, who did some research to try to understand the business opportunities from circular business models and from resale in particular, because obviously if this is going to become mainstream, businesses do need to make money out of it. We do understand that. And they did find lots of opportunities, even with relatively current models to make money from resold clothing. They looked at charity shops, they looked at platforms like Vinted and Depop, and also at Vestiaire and at some own brand things like resale. And for most of these things, especially for added value services like Vestiaire, you can make quite a lot of money if you're doing things like offering validation services or cleaning services. People will pay more. Then I'm surprised they'll pay that much for a resold Zara t-shirt, but they'll pay up to £10 for it on Vestiaire. So there are opportunities right now, without really overhauling the business model, to make money from these sorts of activities. And obviously, in-demand brands retain a lot more value, and designer brands do retain a lot more value. I don't think you'll ever see a Vivienne Westwood dress on Vestiaire for £10, sadly, or even on Vinted. So we also asked them what they wanted to see from government in terms of policies that government might implement. And a lot of these different policies could be incorporated into an extended producer responsibility scheme. And these aren't all the policies we asked them about. It might be difficult to see what we were asking. We were asking about various types of standards, about targets for reduction, for reuse, for recycling, about banning the destruction of unsold goods. So those were some of the ones that we asked about, which were particularly popular, but actually I think we asked about 13, and all of them had majority support. The least popular one was a mandatory repair service that businesses would have to provide. Only 56% of people supported that, and labeling surprisingly wasn't actually that popular, which was interesting to us, because that does seem to be what government in the past has really promoted as the solution. But people really wanted to see things like standards, like bans on the destruction of unsold or even still usable goods. And I think the most interesting finding to me from this was that they innately got the waste hierarchy. So they were overwhelmingly in favor of targets to reduce the overproduction of textiles and to reduce waste. Those were even more popular. They were all popular, but they were even more popular than targets to reuse and targets to recycle. So I think the public innately has an understanding that we are buying too many clothes. So through our business partners, we did a bit of thinking on what businesses could do in the short and the long term. And I think in the short term, there are some easy steps that could be taken around creating appealing platforms like those value-added ones that Vestiaire is promoting, and increasingly like companies like eBay are doing. There was also a lot of exciting talk about technology and how that might help facilitate easier reuse, including that AI and things to help sorting clothes, which I'm sure we'll hear about today, and also to help ensure that people have an easier time of finding the size in different brands. So there are developments around there, and I think really pushing on those is going to be quite useful in the short term. People were also really, really keen on charity partnerships. That was one of the things that they wanted to see businesses do most. And I know a lot of businesses are already partnering with charities. It's largely still on things like collecting and sorting and selling on the unsold stock. And I think that those are really good, but we were wondering, and I don't think we really got to the solution but we were wondering if there could be more in terms of the partnerships and what they might be able to deliver. So I think it would be really useful for businesses to think about that. And then the big challenge, and I don't think we've got the solutions, and I don't think that I haven't seen yet a real appetite in many businesses to tackle this, though it's great that it's being talked about today, is to really start addressing fast fashion. It's an enduring challenge that hasn't been cracked by the rise in reuse and the fact that people are much more interested in that. So that's one for a longer term, but I think is going to be key to reducing the environmental impact of the industry. And then recommendations for governments. In the first instance, we we did say that you should probably ban the destruction of unsold goods. That is, I think, a moral outrage. People were really, really opposed to it. I think that there are definite challenges to it, because that's obviously something that you're tacking on to the end of a system that is at the moment producing a lot of clothes. And the EU is bringing it in. Scotland might bring it in. When the EU was bringing it in, the environmental groups were really quite keen that there weren't big loopholes left in it where you ban the destruction to landfill, but then you just offshore it to other countries. In the UK as well, we're a bit concerned that you might do that, you might have that loophole, but you might also have the loophole where, because you've got these partnerships with charities or charity shops, or where people tend to take the clothes that they don't want, charity shops are left with a lot of clothing that they can't sell on, and that would be unfair to them. So I think we do need to think quite carefully about how that can be brought in. But it is, I think, the moral thing to do, and people would be very behind that sort of approach. We also said that we should be using extended producer responsibility effectively, prioritizing much better data. And so it's great to see the Sandbox project and to hear about all the data that you've collected. I think if we're looking at what's going on in other administrations, there are some additional interesting developments on data, including at the EU level. They're bringing in digital product passports, and the first industry that they're going to require them for is the textiles industry. So there will hopefully be a lot more data around, because I think that historically that has really held back the sorts of activities that we need to see. We also do want to see targets. So one of the things that we've noted with not dismay, but slight disappointment, I think, in any case, about the EU's approach is that they aren't setting targets for reuse and reduction. They're obviously going to, there will be variable fees, there will be requirements to collect material for reuse, for recycling, and those things will be funded, and that is a really positive first step. But it's not centered still on the idea that you need to reduce material use, and even at the Netherlands level, I think they're the ones that have gone farthest so far. They've had their EPR scheme up and running for a year now. They do have reuse targets, which is more than the EU has, and which is a good thing. But we think that the UK could go farther and could really incentivize reduction as part of its EPR scheme. And the powers that the government took in the Environment Act in 2021 actually do allow them to set targets for reduction. I think what we've seen from the EPR scheme that they've developed so far, which is the one on packaging, it has all been focused on recycling. And that is one of the big disappointments with that scheme so far, because even in the packaging world, they realize that is not the answer. We do need to be doing a lot more. And then also the issue of standards is something that needs to be thought about, which the EU is thinking about again, and which the UK does have powers to implement standards for things on durability and recyclability and reusability. And so those we think should be brought in along with the extended producer responsibility scheme. And I think that's the extent of the lessons that I've got for you from other countries. I think it is actually really early days. People are quite early in the journey, but there is definitely more ambition coming out of the EU. There's more ambition coming out of the Netherlands and France as well. And France might, I don't know if it's going to get through the Senate, but they might be, the lower house has approved a fast fashion charge, which is quite substantial. It's between 5 and 10 euros, although there's a caveat that it can't be more than half of the value of the piece of clothing. But they're really doing a lot, and also banning advertising. So there are other administrations that are taking action, and we hope with the new government and their mandate for change, we're going to see a lot more here. And it's great that the business is willing to work with them. So thanks very much for your time today.